Question 1. Quality control measures reveal that a person attending a Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, in Ontario expresses their intention to go hunting next weekend and asks if they can borrow a friend's legally registered firearm to use, as they plan to get their own license soon. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant response? Option A. Inform the individual that they can borrow a licensed firearm and hunt as long as the firearm's registered owner is present and supervising their use. Option B. Advise the individual that they cannot legally possess or transport any firearm without a valid firearms license, and that they must complete the CFSC and obtain the appropriate license before acquiring or using any firearm. Option C. Recommend that the individual only use the firearm for hunting purposes, and that this specific use might be overlooked by authorities if they are not caught. Option D. Suggest that the individual can proceed with hunting using the borrowed firearm, and deal with obtaining their license paperwork later. Correct answer is B. Advise the individual that they cannot legally possess or transport any firearm without a valid firearms license, and that they must complete the CFSC and obtain the appropriate license before acquiring or using any firearm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for a firearm for a legitimate purpose, hunting, with the absolute legal requirement to possess a valid firearms license. The individual's stated intent to obtain a license soon does not negate the current legal obligation. The core challenge lies in preventing immediate harm or illegal activity while upholding the law. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves advising the individual that they cannot legally possess or transport a firearm for any purpose, including hunting, without a valid license. This aligns directly with the Criminal Code of Canada, specifically sections pertaining to the prohibition of possessing firearms without authorization. The Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, curriculum emphasizes that obtaining the appropriate license is a prerequisite for all firearm ownership and use. Therefore, informing the individual of this legal reality and advising them to complete the CFSC and apply for a license before acquiring or using any firearm is the only legally compliant and ethically sound course of action. This approach prioritizes public safety and adherence to the law. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the individual that they can borrow a licensed firearm and hunt as long as the owner is present is incorrect because it misinterprets the law. While supervised use might be permissible under specific circumstances with a licensed individual, the act of possessing or transporting the firearm without a license, even if borrowed, is still an offense. The focus must be on the individual's own legal standing to possess the firearm. Suggesting that the individual can proceed with hunting and deal with the paperwork later is a direct violation of the Criminal Code of Canada. This approach disregards the fundamental legal requirement for a license prior to possession and use, creating a significant legal risk for both the individual and potentially anyone facilitating this action. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of the strict regulatory framework governing firearms in Canada. Recommending that the individual only use the firearm for hunting and not for any other purpose, and that this might be overlooked by authorities, is a dangerous and legally unsound suggestion. The Criminal Code does not create exceptions for possession without a license based on the intended use, nor does it permit individuals to self-assess the likelihood of enforcement. This approach promotes a disregard for the law and undermines the integrity of the firearms regulatory system. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must operate within the strict confines of the Criminal Code of Canada and provincial firearms legislation. The decision-making framework should prioritize legal compliance above all else. When faced with a situation where an individual expresses intent to possess or use a firearm without the necessary authorization, the professional's duty is to clearly and unequivocally inform them of the legal requirements. This involves explaining that the required license must be obtained before any possession or use can legally occur. The professional should then guide the individual towards the correct legal pathway, which in this case is completing the CFSC and applying for the appropriate license. This proactive approach ensures both public safety and legal adherence. Question 2. Which approach would be most appropriate for a licensed firearm owner in Ontario, Canada, transporting a rifle from their residence to a licensed gunsmith for repairs, ensuring compliance with all federal and provincial regulations. Option A. The firearm is unloaded, stored in a locked hard case, and transported directly to the gunsmith's location without any stops for personal reasons. Option B. The firearm is transported loaded in a locked hard case, with the owner making a brief stop at a friend's house. Option C. The firearm is unloaded and carried in the owner's backpack, with no specific case used, as the owner is driving directly to the gunsmith. Option D. The firearm is unloaded and placed in its original soft case, and the owner stops for groceries on the way to the gunsmith. The correct answer is A. The firearm is unloaded, stored in a locked hard case, and transported directly to the gunsmith's location without any stops for personal reasons. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance personal convenience with strict adherence to Canadian federal firearms legislation, specifically the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act, which govern the possession, acquisition, and transportation of firearms. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to serious legal consequences, including criminal charges and the revocation of firearms licenses. Careful judgment is required to ensure all actions are compliant and safe. The best professional approach involves prioritizing safety and legal compliance by ensuring the firearm is unloaded, secured in a locked case, and transported directly to the destination, without any unnecessary stops or deviations. This aligns with the requirements of the Criminal Code of Canada regarding the safe storage and transportation of firearms. Specifically, Section 95 of the Criminal Code addresses the prohibition of carrying a firearm, concealed or unconcealed, with readily available ammunition. Furthermore, the Firearms Act and its associated regulations mandate that firearms be transported in a manner that prevents their use by unauthorized persons. This approach minimizes risk and demonstrates responsible firearm ownership, fulfilling the legal and ethical obligations of a licensed firearm owner in Canada. An incorrect approach would be to transport the firearm unloaded but not in a locked case, or to stop for personal errands en route. Transporting an unloaded firearm without a locked case, while not explicitly prohibited in all circumstances for immediate transport, significantly increases the risk of accidental discharge or unauthorized access, which contravenes the spirit and intent of safe transportation regulations designed to prevent harm. Stopping for personal errands introduces a deviation from the direct route, which can be interpreted as carrying a firearm in a manner that is not for a lawful purpose or is otherwise unsafe, potentially violating transportation provisions. Another incorrect approach would be to transport the firearm loaded, even if it is in a locked case. Transporting a loaded firearm outside of specific, authorized contexts, such as for hunting under strict conditions or by law enforcement, is a serious offense under the Criminal Code of Canada and poses an extreme safety risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the relevant legal obligations and safety considerations. This involves consulting the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act, understanding the specific requirements for transportation, and prioritizing the safety of oneself and the public. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the appropriate authorities, such as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, or a certified firearms instructor, is a crucial step in ensuring compliance and responsible decision-making. Question 3. Investigation of a scenario in Ontario where a licensed firearm owner needs to transport an unloaded rifle in a locked case from their residence to a gunsmith for repairs. The owner is considering stopping briefly at a local convenience store on the way. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action to ensure the firearm remains secure and accessible only to authorized individuals during this transit and brief stop? Option A. Transport the rifle in a locked case, unloaded in the trunk of the vehicle, and proceed directly to the gunsmith without any unscheduled stops. Option B. Transport the rifle in the passenger compartment of the vehicle, unloaded and readily accessible, while stopping at the convenience store. Option C. Leave the locked case containing the unloaded rifle in the vehicle while unattended at the convenience store. Option D. Transport the rifle in the passenger compartment of the vehicle, unloaded in a locked case, while stopping at the convenience store. Correct answer is A. Transport the rifle in a locked case, unloaded in the trunk of the vehicle, and proceed directly to the gunsmith without any unscheduled stops. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance personal convenience and immediate needs with strict adherence to Canadian federal firearms laws, specifically the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act, which govern the possession, storage, and transportation of firearms. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges, and jeopardize an individual's ability to legally own firearms in the future. The decision requires careful judgment to ensure compliance while managing a practical situation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves immediately securing the firearm in a manner that complies with all federal storage regulations. This means ensuring the firearm is unloaded, the action is open, and it is stored in a locked container or a locked display case, separate from ammunition. This approach is correct because it prioritizes public safety and legal compliance above all else. The Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act mandate specific safe storage practices to prevent unauthorized access and accidental discharge. Adhering to these regulations demonstrates responsible firearm ownership and upholds the legal framework designed to protect Canadians. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to leave the firearm unattended in the vehicle, even if locked, while running errands. This is a significant regulatory failure as it violates safe storage requirements. Firearms must be secured in a locked container, and leaving a loaded or unloaded firearm accessible in a vehicle, even for a short period, poses a serious risk of theft or unauthorized use, which is contrary to the spirit and letter of the law. Another incorrect approach is to transport the firearm in the passenger compartment of the vehicle, even if it is unloaded and in a case. Federal regulations generally require firearms to be transported in a manner that prevents them from being readily accessible to the occupants of the vehicle. Transporting it in the passenger area, even if unloaded, increases the risk of it being accessed during transit, which is a violation of safe transportation guidelines. A further incorrect approach is to assume that because the firearm is unloaded, it does not require strict adherence to storage regulations during transport. The law does not differentiate storage requirements based on whether the firearm is loaded or unloaded when it is not under the direct supervision of its owner. All firearms, when not in immediate use, must be stored and transported according to the prescribed safety standards to prevent misuse and ensure public safety. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Canada dealing with firearms must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and public safety. This involves understanding the specific requirements of the Criminal Code of Canada and the Firearms Act regarding possession, storage, and transportation. When faced with a situation requiring temporary storage or transport, the primary consideration should always be how to meet or exceed the legal safety standards. This means proactively identifying the safest and most legally compliant method, rather than seeking the most convenient option. If there is any doubt about compliance, seeking clarification from the appropriate authorities or consulting the official Canadian Firearms Program resources is the responsible course of action. Question 4. Assessment of a situation in Ontario, Canada, where a friend asks you to transport their firearm to another location, stating they are in a hurry and cannot do it themselves. Your friend mentions they have a license but does not provide any details about the firearm's registration or specific transportation protocols. What is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Transport the firearm without verifying your friend's license status or the firearm's registration, assuming they are compliant. Option B. Offer to use your friend's license to transport the firearm, as this would be faster and easier. Option C. Politely decline the request, explaining that transporting a firearm requires adherence to specific legal procedures in Ontario that you cannot bypass. Option D. Agree to transport the firearm, advising your friend to simply hide it securely in the trunk of your vehicle. The correct answer is C. Politely decline the request, explaining that transporting a firearm requires adherence to specific legal procedures in Ontario that you cannot bypass. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a friend's request and the legal requirements for firearm possession and transportation in Ontario, Canada. The individual is faced with the temptation to bypass regulations due to a personal relationship, which could lead to serious legal consequences and compromise public safety. Careful judgment is required to prioritize legal obligations and safety over personal convenience or loyalty. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to firmly but politely decline the request, explaining that transporting a firearm without the proper authorization and documentation is illegal in Ontario. This approach upholds the law, prioritizes public safety, and maintains professional integrity. The Firearms Act Canada and provincial regulations in Ontario strictly govern the transportation of firearms, requiring specific conditions to be met, such as the firearm being unloaded and securely stored, and the individual possessing the appropriate license and registration. Failing to adhere to these regulations can result in severe penalties, including fines and imprisonment. Incorrect approaches analysis. Suggesting the friend simply hide the firearm in the trunk is a direct violation of Ontario's firearm transportation regulations. Firearms must be transported unloaded and in a secure manner, often in a locked case, and not readily accessible. This approach disregards the legal requirements for safe storage and transport, creating a significant safety risk. Offering to borrow the friend's license to transport the firearm is also illegal and highly unethical. Firearm licenses are non-transferable and are tied to the individual who obtained them. Using another person's license constitutes fraud and a serious breach of firearm safety laws, putting both individuals at risk of severe legal repercussions. Agreeing to transport the firearm without confirming the friend's license status or the firearm's registration is negligent. It assumes compliance without verification, which is contrary to the responsible handling of firearms. This approach fails to acknowledge the legal responsibilities of both the owner and the transporter of a firearm, potentially making the individual complicit in an illegal act. Professional reasoning. Professionals in any field involving regulated items, especially firearms, must operate within a strict decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, public safety, and ethical conduct. When faced with a request that conflicts with these principles, the framework involves 1. Identifying the legal and ethical obligations. 2. Assessing the potential risks and consequences of compliance or noncompliance. 3. Communicating clearly and assertively about legal boundaries. 4. Seeking clarification or guidance from appropriate authorities if unsure. 5. Refusing any request that compromises safety or legality, regardless of personal relationships. Question 5. Quality control measures reveal that a resident of Ontario wishes to participate in a hunting trip next month and needs to acquire a firearm. They have a friend who owns a suitable firearm and has offered to lend it for the trip. What is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action for the Ontario resident to take? Option A. Purchase the firearm directly from the friend, assuming a verbal agreement is sufficient for the transfer of possession. Option B. Rely on the friend's assurance that they will supervise the use of the firearm during the hunting trip, negating the need for a personal license. Option C. Complete the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, pass the examination, and apply for a Possession and Acquisition License, PAL, before the hunting trip. Option D. Borrow the firearm from their friend immediately, as the friend is a trusted individual, and the firearm will only be used for a short period. The correct answer is C. Complete the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, pass the examination, and apply for a Possession and Acquisition License, PAL, before the hunting trip. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for a firearm for a specific purpose with the legal and safety obligations mandated by Canadian federal and provincial firearms legislation. The pressure to acquire a firearm quickly for a legitimate activity, such as hunting or sport shooting, can tempt individuals to bypass or rush through crucial safety and legal procedures. This highlights the importance of a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety and compliance above all else. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves strictly adhering to the legal requirements for acquiring and possessing a firearm in Ontario. This means completing the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, passing the associated examination, and then applying for a Possession and Acquisition License, PAL. The PAL application process includes a thorough background check and references, ensuring that only responsible individuals are permitted to own firearms. This approach is correct because it directly aligns with the core principles of the Firearms Act Canada and provincial regulations in Ontario, which are designed to promote public safety and prevent firearms from falling into the wrong hands. The CFSC and PAL system are the foundational pillars of legal firearm ownership in Canada. Incorrect approach is analysis. Taking possession of a firearm from a friend without first obtaining a valid PAL is a direct violation of the Firearms Act Canada. This bypasses the mandatory licensing and registration system, which is a critical safety measure. Demonstrates a disregard for the legal framework designed to ensure accountability and responsible ownership. Purchasing a firearm from a private seller without verifying their PAL status and ensuring the transfer is conducted through a licensed dealer is also illegal. This circumvents the legal transfer process, which includes verifying the buyer's PAL and ensuring the firearm is properly registered. It creates a significant risk of firearms being transferred to individuals who are not legally permitted to possess them. Assuming that a verbal agreement with a friend is sufficient for temporary firearm possession ignores the explicit legal requirements for firearm transfers and possession in Ontario. The law requires specific documentation and licensing for any transfer of ownership or possession, regardless of the relationship between the parties. This approach demonstrates a lack of understanding of the legal obligations and a potentially dangerous assumption about firearm control. Professional reasoning. Professionals in any field involving regulated items, especially firearms, must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and safety. This framework should involve 1. Identifying all relevant legal requirements and regulations. 2. Understanding the purpose and intent behind these regulations, e.g., public safety, responsible ownership. 3. Evaluating potential actions against these legal and ethical standards. 4. Seeking clarification or professional advice when unsure. 5. Prioritizing long-term compliance and safety over short-term convenience or perceived urgency. Question 6. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a close friend, who you know is in the process of obtaining their possession and acquisition license, PAL, has asked if you could temporarily hold onto their newly acquired rifle in Ontario until their license is finalized, as they are eager to have it stored safely with you. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Offer to simply forget about the transfer and let your friend keep the rifle at your place until they get their license. Option B. Politely explain that you cannot legally take possession of the firearm without the proper transfer documentation and the friend possessing a valid PAL, and suggest they consult the RCMP Canadian Firearms Program for the correct transfer procedures. Option C. Suggest that your friend can borrow the rifle for a few days while they wait for their license to be fully processed. Option D. Agree to hold the rifle for your friend, assuring them you will keep it safe until their PAL is issued. The correct answer is B. Politely explain that you cannot legally take possession of the firearm without the proper transfer documentation and the friend possessing a valid PAL, and suggest they consult the RCMP Canadian Firearms Program for the correct transfer procedures. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate desire to assist a friend with the absolute legal and ethical obligations surrounding the safe and lawful transfer of firearms in Ontario, Canada. The pressure of a social relationship can cloud judgment, making it crucial to adhere strictly to established procedures to prevent potential harm and legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all legal requirements are met, regardless of personal connections. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves politely but firmly explaining to the friend that the firearm cannot be legally transferred without proper documentation and adherence to the Canadian Firearms Program regulations. This approach prioritizes safety and legal compliance by acknowledging the friend's request, but immediately redirecting the interaction towards the correct, lawful process. This aligns with the core principles of the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, and the Firearms Act, which mandates strict procedures for all firearm transfers to ensure public safety and prevent unauthorized possession. Specifically, it upholds the requirement for a valid possession and acquisition license, PAL, for the recipient and the proper registration or transfer process as outlined by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP Canadian Firearms Program. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves agreeing to hold the firearm for the friend until they sort out their paperwork. This is problematic because it constitutes unauthorized possession and potentially illegal storage of a firearm. The individual taking possession would be responsible for its safe storage and would be in violation of firearms laws if they do not have the legal authority to possess it. This bypasses the legal transfer process and creates a significant liability. Another incorrect approach is to suggest the friend can simply borrow the firearm for a short period. This is a dangerous misinterpretation of firearms law. Firearms cannot be borrowed in the same way as other items. Any transfer of possession, even temporary, must adhere to the legal transfer requirements, including the recipient having a valid PAL. This approach normalizes unsafe and illegal firearm handling. A further incorrect approach is to offer to forget about the transfer and just let the friend keep it. This is a direct violation of Canadian firearms legislation. Failing to report a firearm transfer or allowing an unlicensed individual to possess a firearm carries severe legal penalties, including fines and imprisonment. It also undermines the entire system designed to track firearm ownership and prevent them from falling into the wrong hands. Professional reasoning. Professionals in any field involving regulated items, especially firearms, must employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and public safety above all else. This involves 1. Identifying the core legal and ethical obligations, e.g., Firearms Act CFSC principles. 2. Recognizing potential pressures or influences that might lead to deviation from these obligations, e.g., personal relationships. 3. Clearly communicating the legal requirements to all parties involved. 4. Refusing to engage in any action that would circumvent or violate established regulations. 5. Offering to guide individuals towards the correct, lawful procedures. Question 7. Quality control measures reveal that a potential client in Ontario, Canada, has approached a certified firearms instructor expressing a strong desire to immediately begin firearms training for a handgun, stating they do not wish to go through the licensing process as they believe it is too cumbersome. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action for the instructor? Option A. Politely decline to provide any training and dismiss the individual without explaining the legal requirements for firearm ownership in Ontario. Option B. Proceed with the training as requested, assuming the individual will obtain the license later, as the training itself is not illegal. Option C. Clearly explain to the individual that obtaining a possession and acquisition license, PAL, is a mandatory legal requirement in Ontario before any firearms training for the purpose of ownership can commence, and provide information on the proper application process. Option D. Advise the individual on informal methods to acquire a firearm without a license, suggesting they can sort out the paperwork afterwards. The correct answer is C. Clearly explain to the individual that obtaining a possession and acquisition license, PAL, is a mandatory legal requirement in Ontario before any firearms training for the purpose of ownership can commence, and provide information on the proper application process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it involves a direct conflict between a client's stated desire and the legal requirements for firearm ownership in Ontario, Canada. The challenge lies in upholding the law while maintaining a professional relationship and ensuring public safety. A firearm instructor must exercise careful judgment to avoid enabling illegal activity or alienating a potential client unnecessarily. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves clearly and unequivocally informing the individual about the legal requirements for obtaining a firearm license in Ontario, specifically the mandatory possession and acquisition license, PAL. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the Firearms Act Canada and the provincial regulations governing firearm ownership in Ontario. It prioritizes public safety and legal compliance by ensuring the individual understands the necessary steps before proceeding. Providing accurate information about the PAL application process, including the required safety courses and background checks, is a fundamental ethical and legal obligation of a certified instructor. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the training without addressing the licensing requirement. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it bypasses the legal framework designed to ensure only qualified individuals possess firearms. It demonstrates a disregard for the Firearms Act and potentially contributes to illegal firearm acquisition, posing a serious public safety risk. Another incorrect approach is to suggest that the licensing process can be circumvented or expedited through informal means. This is not only unethical but also illegal and could lead to severe penalties for both the instructor and the individual. It undermines the integrity of the licensing system and demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the individual's request outright without providing any information or guidance. While the individual's initial request may be problematic, a professional instructor should aim to educate and guide, rather than simply refuse. This approach fails to uphold the educational aspect of the instructor's role and misses an opportunity to ensure the individual understands and complies with the law. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and public safety. This involves 1. Identifying the core issue. The client's request conflicts with legal requirements. 2. Consulting relevant regulations. Understanding the Firearms Act and Ontario's specific firearm laws. 3. Communicating legal obligations clearly, informing the client of the mandatory PAL and its prerequisites. 4. Offering lawful alternatives, guiding the client through the correct licensing process. 5. Documenting interactions, maintaining records of advice given. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are grounded in law, ethics, and a commitment to safety. Question 8. Quality control measures reveal that a friend, who is not a licensed firearm owner in Ontario, has asked to borrow your registered firearm for a hunting trip next weekend. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with Canadian firearms laws and promote safe firearm handling? Option A. Refuse to lend the firearm and advise your friend to pursue the necessary licensing and registration to acquire their own firearm. Option B. Lend the firearm to your friend, but insist on supervising them closely during its use. Option C. Allow your friend to use the firearm on your property under your direct supervision without formally transferring possession. Option D. Suggest your friend obtain a temporary permit for your firearm for the duration of the hunting trip. The correct answer is A. Refuse to lend the firearm and advise your friend to pursue the necessary licensing and registration to acquire their own firearm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate desire to assist a friend with the strict legal obligations and safety protocols mandated by Canadian firearms legislation. The potential for misuse or unsafe handling of a firearm, even with a friend, necessitates a rigorous adherence to the law to prevent harm and maintain public safety. The pressure to accommodate a friend can create an ethical dilemma, but the paramount importance of legal compliance and responsible firearm ownership overrides personal convenience. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves unequivocally refusing to lend the firearm and instead advising the friend to obtain their own firearm legally. This aligns directly with the requirements of the Firearms Act Canada and the Criminal Code of Canada. The law requires individuals to possess the appropriate licenses and registrations for any firearm they possess or use. Lending a firearm to an unlicensed individual or allowing an unlicensed individual to possess it constitutes an illegal transfer and can lead to severe penalties for both parties. This approach prioritizes legal compliance, public safety, and responsible firearm stewardship, which are fundamental tenets of Canadian firearms safety. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that involves lending the firearm with the understanding that the friend will be supervised is incorrect because it still facilitates an illegal transfer of possession. The Firearms Act and Criminal Code do not permit the temporary lending of firearms to individuals who do not possess the requisite licenses and registrations. Supervision does not negate the illegality of the possession itself. An approach that involves allowing the friend to use the firearm on the owner's property without formally transferring possession is also incorrect. While the firearm may remain under the owner's direct control, allowing an unlicensed individual to handle and discharge the firearm still contravenes the spirit and letter of the law, which aims to ensure that only trained and licensed individuals have access to firearms. This could be interpreted as enabling unauthorized use and possession. An approach that involves suggesting the friend obtain a temporary permit for the firearm is incorrect because such permits are typically for specific, limited circumstances, e.g., specific events, transportation for specific purposes, and are not a general mechanism for allowing unlicensed individuals to use a firearm for recreational purposes. the fundamental requirement for a license and registration for possession and use remains. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal obligations above all else. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant legal statutes and regulations, Firearms Act, Criminal Code of Canada. 2. Assessing the proposed action against these legal requirements. 3. Recognizing the ethical imperative to uphold public safety and responsible firearm ownership. 4. Communicating the legal and safety reasons for refusal clearly and respectfully. 5. Offering constructive legal alternatives, such as advising the friend on the proper licensing and registration process. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are not based on personal relationships or convenience, but on a foundation of legal compliance and ethical responsibility. Question 9. The risk matrix shows a potential concern regarding a neighbor's expressed admiration for a newly acquired rifle and their history of minor property disputes. As a licensed firearm owner in Ontario, Canada, what is the most appropriate initial step to manage this situation? Option A. Immediately report the neighbor to the police for an unfounded suspicion of intent to steal the firearm. Option B. Directly confront the neighbor about their comments and perceived intentions regarding the rifle. Option C. Document the neighbor's comments and observed behavior and discreetly consult with the local police service's firearms liaison officer. Option D. Ignore the neighbor's comments and observed behavior, assuming they are harmless. The correct answer is C. Document the neighbor's comments and observed behavior, and discreetly consult with the local police service's firearms liaison officer. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential conflict between a firearm owner's stated intent for a newly acquired rifle and the observed behavior of a neighbor who has expressed admiration for the rifle and has a history of minor property disputes. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the rights of a licensed firearm owner with the need to address potential safety concerns without overstepping boundaries or making unsubstantiated accusations. Careful judgment is required to assess the level of risk and determine the appropriate course of action under the Canadian Firearms Program regulations. The best approach involves documenting the observed behavior and the neighbor's comments, then discreetly consulting with the local police service's firearms liaison officer. This is correct because it adheres to the principle of responsible firearm ownership and reporting suspicious activity without immediate escalation. The Firearms Act and associated regulations emphasize reporting concerns to the appropriate authorities. Consulting the police liaison officer allows for an informed assessment of the situation based on established protocols and existing intelligence, ensuring that any potential risk is managed professionally and within legal frameworks. This approach respects the rights of the firearm owner while prioritizing public safety. An approach that involves directly confronting the neighbor about their comments and perceived intentions is incorrect. This could escalate the situation unnecessarily, create a hostile environment, and potentially lead to a complaint against the firearm owner for harassment or intimidation, violating the spirit of responsible firearm ownership and community relations. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the neighbor's comments and observed behavior, assuming they are harmless. This fails to acknowledge the potential for escalating risk and neglects the ethical responsibility to report concerning observations that could impact public safety, as outlined in the general principles of firearm safety and responsible ownership. Finally, an approach that involves immediately reporting the neighbor to the police for an unfounded suspicion of intent to steal the firearm is also incorrect. This constitutes an unsubstantiated accusation and could lead to unnecessary police resources being diverted, potentially damaging the neighbor's reputation and creating an adversarial relationship without sufficient evidence. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes information gathering, objective assessment of risk, and consultation with appropriate authorities. This involves understanding the nuances of the situation, considering all relevant information, and acting in accordance with legal and ethical guidelines to ensure both public safety and the rights of individuals. Question 10. Process analysis reveals that a licensed individual in Ontario is preparing to transport 2 semi-automatic rifles, each with a maximum magazine capacity of 5 rounds, to a shooting range. They intend to carry a total of 20 rounds of ammunition for these rifles. What is the maximum number of ammunition containers, each holding no more than 5 rounds, that they must use to legally transport this ammunition according to Canadian firearms regulations. Option A, 3 containers. Option B, 2 containers. Option C, 4 containers. Option D, 5 containers. The correct answer is C, 4 containers. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the safe and legal transportation of firearms in Ontario, Canada. The core difficulty lies in accurately calculating the required number of ammunition containers based on the firearm's capacity and the legal restrictions on ammunition quantity per firearm. Miscalculation can lead to non-compliance with the Firearms Act, Canada, and its associated regulations, potentially resulting in charges and the confiscation of firearms. Careful judgment is required to ensure all legal parameters are met. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a precise calculation that accounts for the maximum legal ammunition capacity per firearm and the number of firearms being transported. This approach directly adheres to the principles of safe and legal firearm transportation as outlined in the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, curriculum, and relevant provincial regulations in Ontario. Specifically, it recognizes that for a semi-automatic rifle with a maximum magazine capacity of 5 rounds, and transporting 2 such rifles, the maximum allowable ammunition is 10 rounds, 5 rounds per rifle. This is achieved by carrying ammunition in containers that do not exceed the legal limit for a single firearm, thus ensuring compliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves calculating the total ammunition based on a misunderstanding of the per firearm limit, such as multiplying the number of firearms by a higher, arbitrary number of rounds. This fails to respect the specific legal limit of 5 rounds per firearm for this type of rifle, leading to an overtransport of ammunition and contravention of regulations. Another incorrect approach might be to simply divide the total desired ammunition by the number of firearms without considering the maximum capacity of the magazines themselves. This could result in suggesting carrying more than 5 rounds per firearm, even if the total is less than some arbitrary overall limit, still violating the per firearm restriction. A further incorrect approach could be to assume that any ammunition container is acceptable as long as it's separate from the firearm, without verifying the quantity within each container against the legal per firearm limit. This overlooks the critical detail that the law specifies a maximum of 5 rounds per firearm for this category of rifle, regardless of how the ammunition is packaged, as long as it's intended for that firearm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach firearm transportation by first identifying the specific type of firearm and its legal magazine capacity. They must then consult the relevant sections of the Firearms Act, Canada, and Ontario regulations regarding ammunition transport. The calculation should be a direct application of these rules. Maximum rounds per firearm multiplied by the number of firearms, ensuring no single container exceeds the per firearm limit. If in doubt, it is always best to err on the side of caution and transport less ammunition than the maximum allowed. Question 11. The efficiency study reveals a potential issue with firearm storage in a rural Saskatchewan residence, where the owner expresses a need for quick access to firearms for protection against wildlife. Considering the legal framework of Saskatchewan and Canada, which of the following actions best addresses this situation while ensuring compliance with firearms safety regulations? Option A. Advise the owner that due to the need for quick access, current storage practices, even if perceived as secure by the owner, are acceptable as long as they are not overtly dangerous. Option B. Recommend immediate confiscation of firearms until a more secure, albeit less accessible, storage solution can be implemented, without first exploring compliant alternatives. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the owner about the legal requirements for safe storage, exploring compliant methods that balance their need for accessibility with the necessity of firearms being unloaded and securely stored. Option D. Suggest the owner store firearms unlocked but in a locked room, as this provides a reasonable balance between security and accessibility for protection against wildlife. The correct answer is C. Engage in a detailed discussion with the owner about the legal requirements for safe storage, exploring compliant methods that balance their need for accessibility with the necessity of firearms being unloaded and securely stored. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential gap in the safe storage of firearms within a rural household in Saskatchewan. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal obligations of firearm ownership with the practical realities of rural living, where immediate access might be perceived as necessary for protection against wildlife or perceived threats. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Saskatchewan Firearms Act and the Criminal Code of Canada without unduly burdening the owner or creating an unsafe situation. The best approach involves a thorough, non-confrontational discussion with the firearm owner about the specific requirements for safe storage as mandated by Canadian federal and provincial law. This includes understanding the legal definitions of unloaded, locked, and inaccessible in the context of the Criminal Code of Canada and the Saskatchewan Firearms Act. The discussion should focus on identifying practical, compliant storage solutions that meet the owner's concerns about accessibility for legitimate purposes, e.g., hunting, sport shooting, while strictly adhering to the law. This approach is correct because it prioritizes education and compliance, fostering a positive relationship with the firearm owner and ensuring the highest standard of public safety and legal adherence. It directly addresses the identified efficiency gap by seeking to implement legally sound storage practices. An incorrect approach would be to immediately recommend confiscation or to dismiss the owner's concerns about accessibility without exploring compliant solutions. This fails to acknowledge the owner's rights and responsibilities under the law and could lead to resistance or a lack of cooperation. Another incorrect approach would be to accept a storage method that appears convenient but does not meet the strict legal definition of safe storage, such as storing firearms unlocked in a cabinet that is not secured to a wall, even if the owner believes it is sufficient for their needs. This demonstrates a failure to uphold the legal standards for firearm safety and could create a significant risk. Simply advising the owner to be more careful without providing specific, legally compliant guidance is also insufficient and ethically problematic, as it abdicates the responsibility to ensure proper understanding and implementation of safe storage practices. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific legal requirements of the jurisdiction, Saskatchewan and Canada. This should be followed by a clear, objective assessment of the situation, gathering information from the individual involved. The next step is to identify potential solutions that are both legally compliant and practically feasible for the individual, prioritizing safety and education. Finally, professionals must ensure that the chosen solution is implemented and that ongoing compliance is monitored, always acting with integrity and a commitment to public safety. Question 12. What factors determine the legality of assisting a friend in acquiring a firearm for self-protection in Ontario, Canada, when the friend has not yet completed the required safety course or obtained a license? Option A. The friend's completion of the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, and their successful acquisition of a Possession and Acquisition License, PAL. Option B. The applicant's intention to transfer the firearm to the friend once the friend has obtained their license. Option C. The applicant's possession of a valid firearms license and their ability to provide the firearm to the friend for immediate use. Option D. The friend's stated need for self-protection and the applicant's willingness to facilitate the acquisition by purchasing the firearm on their behalf. The correct answer is D. The friend's stated need for self-protection and the applicant's willingness to facilitate the acquisition by purchasing the firearm on their behalf. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between a friend's perceived need for a firearm for self-protection and the strict legal requirements for firearm acquisition in Ontario, Canada. The applicant's eagerness and the friend's persuasive nature create pressure to bypass established procedures. Failure to adhere to the law could result in severe penalties for both individuals and compromise public safety. Careful judgment is required to prioritize legal compliance and safety over personal relationships and perceived urgency. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves unequivocally advising the friend that they must independently complete the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, and obtain their own Possession and Acquisition License, PAL, before they can legally acquire any firearm. This aligns directly with the requirements of the Firearms Act Canada and the Criminal Code of Canada, which mandate that any individual wishing to possess or acquire a firearm must hold a valid PAL. The process ensures that individuals have demonstrated the necessary knowledge of safe firearm handling, storage, and the relevant laws. This approach prioritizes legal compliance and public safety above all else, preventing any illegal transfer or co-acquisition of a firearm. Incorrect approach is analysis. Advising the friend that you can purchase the firearm on their behalf and then transfer it to them once they have their license is a direct violation of the Firearms Act Canada. Firearms cannot be acquired by one individual and then transferred to another without following the prescribed legal transfer process, which includes the recipient having a valid PAL. This action constitutes an illegal transfer and could lead to charges for both parties. Suggesting that the friend can use your existing firearm for self-protection without them having their own license is also illegal. While a licensed individual can possess firearms, allowing an unlicensed individual to use or have access to a firearm without proper authorization or supervision is a serious offense under Canadian law. This circumvents the licensing system designed to ensure only qualified individuals possess firearms. Offering to lend your firearm to the friend for an extended period without them obtaining their own license is essentially an illegal transfer of possession. The legal framework in Canada is designed to ensure that every individual who possesses a firearm is licensed and has undergone the required training. This approach bypasses that fundamental safety measure and exposes both individuals to legal repercussions. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must operate with an unwavering commitment to the legal framework governing firearms in Canada. The decision-making process should always begin with a thorough understanding of the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code. When faced with a request that appears to circumvent these laws, the professional's duty is to educate the individual on the correct legal procedures and refuse any action that would facilitate an illegal acquisition or possession. The priority is always public safety and adherence to the law, even when it means disappointing a friend or client. Question 13. Compliance review shows that a firearm has been discovered unattended in a public park in Toronto, Ontario. The individual who found it is not a licensed firearm owner, but is concerned about public safety. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action to ensure compliance with Canadian firearms legislation and provincial regulations in Ontario? Option A. Attempt to find the owner of the firearm and return it directly to them without involving authorities. Option B. Secure the firearm immediately in a safe and unloaded manner, ensuring it is locked and stored separately from ammunition, and then contact the local police to report the discovery and arrange for its legal transfer or storage. Option C. Take possession of the firearm and store it in their personal vehicle until they can decide on the next steps. Option D. Leave the firearm at the scene and wait for law enforcement to arrive, assuming they will secure it. The correct answer is B. Secure the firearm immediately in a safe and unloaded manner, ensuring it is locked and stored separately from ammunition, and then contact the local police to report the discovery and arrange for its legal transfer or storage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need to secure a firearm with the legal and ethical obligations surrounding its transfer and storage. Misinterpreting or neglecting the specific requirements of the Canadian Firearms Program, CFP, and provincial legislation in Ontario can lead to serious legal consequences, including charges related to unsafe storage and illegal possession. The urgency of the situation, coupled with the potential for public safety risks, necessitates a clear understanding of the law and responsible action. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves immediately securing the firearm in a manner that complies with the Firearms Act Canada and Ontario's provincial laws regarding firearm storage. This means ensuring the firearm is unloaded, locked, and stored separately from ammunition, and that the storage location is secure and inaccessible to unauthorized individuals. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the immediate safety concern while adhering to the strict legal framework governing firearms in Canada, specifically the storage requirements outlined in the Firearms Act and relevant provincial regulations. This proactive measure prioritizes public safety and legal compliance. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately take possession of the firearm and store it in a personal residence without first confirming its legal status or ensuring it is unloaded and secured according to regulations. This fails to account for potential legal restrictions on possession and the mandatory safe storage requirements, potentially leading to charges of unsafe storage or illegal possession if the individual is not a licensed owner or if the storage does not meet legal standards. Another incorrect approach would be to leave the firearm unattended at the scene, assuming law enforcement will handle it. This neglects the immediate responsibility to prevent unauthorized access and potential misuse, which is a core principle of firearm safety and public protection. It also fails to comply with the legal obligation to secure a found firearm in a safe manner. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to transfer the firearm to another individual without verifying their legal eligibility to possess it or ensuring the transfer is conducted through proper legal channels. This bypasses crucial legal safeguards designed to prevent firearms from falling into the wrong hands and could result in charges related to illegal transfer or aiding in illegal possession. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes immediate safety, followed by strict adherence to legal requirements. This involves 1. Assessing the immediate risk and taking steps to mitigate it, e.g., ensuring the firearm is unloaded if safe to do so. 2. Consulting relevant legislation, Firearms Act, provincial laws to understand specific storage and possession requirements. 3. Contacting appropriate authorities, e.g., local police, for guidance on proper handling and transfer if immediate compliance is uncertain. 4. Documenting all actions taken. Question 14. The efficiency study reveals that a licensed firearms dealer in Ontario has been storing newly acquired firearms in a temporary, unlocked cabinet within their main showroom for a period of up to 48 hours before transferring them to a secure vault. This practice is intended to facilitate quick display and sales. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the dealer to take to ensure compliance with Canadian firearms laws and safety principles? Option A. Continue the current practice but instruct staff to maintain heightened vigilance and restrict customer access to the immediate vicinity of the cabinet. Option B. Inform the Chief Firearms Officer of the Province of Ontario about the study's findings and request an extension to upgrade storage facilities. Option C. Immediately remove all firearms from the unlocked cabinet and secure them in a legally compliant locked container or vault, even if it means temporarily halting showroom display until a permanent, compliant storage solution for the showroom is implemented. Option D. Store the firearms in a locked office drawer within the premises, which is not a designated firearm safe or vault, but is considered more secure than the showroom cabinet. The correct answer is C. Immediately remove all firearms from the unlocked cabinet and secure them in a legally compliant locked container or vault, even if it means temporarily halting showroom display until a permanent, compliant storage solution for the showroom is implemented. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential issue with the storage of firearms at a licensed premises in Ontario. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal obligations for safe storage with the practicalities of managing inventory and customer access, all while adhering strictly to the Firearms Act, Canada, and its associated regulations, as well as provincial laws and the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, principles. Misinterpreting or neglecting these requirements can lead to severe legal consequences, including license suspension or revocation, and compromise public safety. The best approach involves immediately ceasing the practice of storing firearms in a manner that does not meet the minimum security requirements mandated by law. This means ensuring that all firearms are stored in a locked container, safe, or vault that meets the specific standards outlined in the storage, display, transportation and handling of firearms by peace officers' regulations, or as otherwise prescribed by law. This approach prioritizes compliance with the Firearms Act Canada and the Criminal Code of Canada, which are paramount in ensuring public safety and preventing unauthorized access to firearms. The CFSC curriculum emphasizes that safe storage is a non-negotiable aspect of responsible firearm ownership and possession. An incorrect approach would be to continue the current storage method while planning to upgrade the storage facilities at a later date, assuming the risk is minimal due to infrequent access. This fails to address the immediate legal requirement for safe storage, creating an ongoing risk of unauthorized access and contravening the principle that all firearms must be stored securely at all times. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the owner's personal assurance of security and discretion, without implementing legally mandated physical security measures. This bypasses the objective standards set by law and the CFSC, which are designed to mitigate risk regardless of individual assurances. Finally, an approach that involves temporarily storing firearms in a less secure but more accessible location within the premises, such as a locked office drawer, would also be incorrect. While seemingly more secure than an unlocked cabinet, it likely does not meet the stringent requirements for a locked container or safe as defined by regulations, and still presents an unacceptable risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific legal requirements for firearm storage in Ontario under the Firearms Act, Canada, and related regulations. This should be followed by an assessment of current practices against these requirements. If a discrepancy is found, the immediate priority is to implement a compliant storage solution, even if it requires temporary measures that strictly adhere to the law, before pursuing long-term upgrades. Continuous training and adherence to CFSC principles are essential for maintaining a culture of safety and compliance. Question 15. The efficiency study reveals that a resident in rural Ontario stores their hunting rifles in a locked gun cabinet within their detached garage. The cabinet is secured with a standard padlock. Ammunition is stored in a separate, unlocked metal box also within the garage. The resident states they are a responsible owner and have never had an incident. Considering the legal requirements for firearm storage in Ontario, which of the following storage practices best aligns with regulatory compliance and public safety? Option A. Rely on the fact that the firearms are in a locked cabinet and the owner is deemed responsible as no incidents have occurred. Option B. Store ammunition in a separate unlocked metal box, as the primary concern is securing the firearms themselves. Option C. Keep the firearms in the locked cabinet, but consider removing the firing pins as an additional safety measure, while leaving ammunition in the unlocked box. Option D. Ensure the gun cabinet is secured with a robust lock, that all firearms within are unloaded and have trigger locks engaged, and that ammunition is stored separately in a locked container. The correct answer is D. Ensure the gun cabinet is secured with a robust lock, that all firearms within are unloaded and have trigger locks engaged, and that ammunition is stored separately in a locked container. Explanation: the efficiency study reveals a potential gap in the safe storage of firearms within a rural household in Ontario, Canada. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal obligations of firearm ownership with the practical realities of rural living, where distances to secure storage facilities might be significant, and the definition of secure can be subject to interpretation. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Firearms Act, Ontario, and its associated regulations without imposing undue hardship or creating an unsafe environment. The best approach involves a thorough review of the household's current firearm storage practices against the specific requirements of the Ontario Firearms Act and the Canadian Criminal Code. This includes verifying that all firearms are stored unloaded, with trigger locks or other safety devices engaged, and separated from their ammunition. Furthermore, it necessitates confirming that firearms are stored in a locked container, safe, or vault that is inaccessible to unauthorized individuals, particularly minors or individuals prohibited from possessing firearms. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal framework governing firearm safety in Ontario, prioritizing public safety and responsible ownership as mandated by law. It ensures that all regulatory requirements are met, thereby mitigating risks of accidental discharge, theft, or unauthorized use. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the firearms are kept in a locked shed on the property, this constitutes adequate secure storage. It fails to consider the specific requirements of the law, which often mandates that the locked container itself be of a type that prevents unauthorized access, and that firearms be unloaded and separated from ammunition. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the owner's verbal assurance that they are careful with their firearms. While personal responsibility is important, it does not replace the legally mandated safety protocols. The law requires demonstrable security measures, not just a statement of intent. Finally, an approach that suggests simply removing the firing pins from the firearms without using a locked container or separating ammunition would also be deficient. While disabling the firearm is a safety measure, it does not meet the comprehensive storage requirements of the legislation, which typically includes physical barriers and ammunition segregation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant legislation. In this case, the Ontario Firearms Act and the Criminal Code of Canada. This should be followed by a factual assessment of the current situation, comparing it against the legal requirements. Where discrepancies exist, the focus should be on identifying solutions that achieve full compliance while considering practical constraints, always prioritizing safety and legality. Question 16. The efficiency study reveals that a resident in rural Ontario, concerned about wildlife, has been storing their hunting rifle unloaded but with ammunition readily accessible in a separate, unlocked drawer in their home. They believe this provides adequate security and quick access if needed. Considering the legal framework for firearm ownership in Ontario, which of the following actions best addresses this situation? Option A. Accept the resident's current storage method as sufficient given their stated concerns about wildlife and the fact that the rifle is unloaded. Option B. Advise the resident to ensure the rifle is unloaded and stored in a locked container, and that the ammunition is also stored securely in a separate locked container, in full compliance with the Criminal Code of Canada's safe storage regulations. Option C. Instruct the resident to keep the rifle loaded, but place it in a locked gun cabinet that is easily accessible within their home. Option D. Recommend that the resident immediately surrender all firearms to the local police for safekeeping until their security concerns are resolved. Correct answer is B. Advise the resident to ensure the rifle is unloaded and stored in a locked container, and that the ammunition is also stored securely in a separate locked container, in full compliance with the Criminal Code of Canada's safe storage regulations. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential gap in the safe storage of firearms within a rural household in Ontario, Canada. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal obligations of firearm ownership with the practical realities of living in a remote area, where immediate access might be perceived as necessary for protection against wildlife. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Firearms Act, Ontario, and its associated regulations without compromising the owner's sense of security, provided that security measures do not violate the law. The best approach involves a thorough review of the current storage practices against the specific requirements of the Ontario Firearms Act and the Criminal Code of Canada concerning the safe storage of prohibited and non-prohibited firearms. This includes ensuring all firearms are unloaded, securely stored in a locked container or device that prevents them from being fired, and that ammunition is stored separately and also securely. The owner must be educated on the legal definitions of secure storage and the potential consequences of non-compliance, which can include license suspension, firearm seizure, and criminal charges. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal mandate for safe storage, prioritizing public safety and adherence to Canadian federal and provincial laws. An incorrect approach would be to accept the owner's justification of needing immediate access for protection against wildlife without verifying if their current storage method meets legal requirements. This fails to uphold the legal obligation to store firearms safely, potentially leaving them accessible to unauthorized individuals, including children, or in a condition that could lead to accidental discharge. This approach is ethically and legally flawed as it prioritizes a subjective perception of need over established safety regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to recommend the owner simply remove all firearms from the residence and store them at a distant, licensed facility. While this would ensure the firearms are not accessible in the home, it may not be a practical or legally mandated solution if the owner is compliant with all safe storage regulations within their own property. The law requires safe storage, not necessarily complete removal, unless storage cannot be made safe. This approach oversteps the legal requirements and may cause undue hardship. A third incorrect approach would be to advise the owner to keep firearms loaded but locked in a gun safe that is easily accessible. While a gun safe is part of secure storage, the requirement for firearms to be unloaded when stored, unless specific exceptions apply, which are rare and highly regulated, is paramount. Leaving firearms loaded even in a locked safe can violate the Criminal Code of Canada's safe storage provisions, particularly regarding the prevention of accidental discharge. The professional reasoning process for this situation should involve 1. Identifying the core issue, potential noncompliance with safe storage regulations. 2. Consulting the relevant legislation, the Ontario Firearms Act and the Criminal Code of Canada. 3. Assessing the current situation against legal requirements, focusing on unloaded firearms, locked containers, and separate ammunition storage. 4. Educating the owner on legal obligations and consequences. 5. Recommending practical, legally compliant solutions that address the owner's concerns while prioritizing safety. Question 17. The efficiency study reveals that a firearms owner in Ontario, Canada, has recently inherited several non-restricted firearms and has stored them in a locked cabinet in their basement. The owner states they have unloaded the firearms and placed them in the cabinet, but they have also placed ammunition in the same cabinet, albeit in a separate box. The owner is a licensed individual and has registered the inherited firearms. The firearms safety instructor is tasked with assessing the safety of this storage arrangement. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the instructor? Option A. Inform the owner that since the firearms are unloaded and locked in a cabinet, and they possess a valid license and registration, the storage arrangement is acceptable, as the intent is clearly to prevent unauthorized access. Option B. Advise the owner that while the firearms are unloaded and in a locked cabinet, storing ammunition in the same locked cabinet, even in a separate box, is not compliant with the Criminal Code of Canada's safe storage regulations for non-restricted firearms, and recommend immediate separation of firearms and ammunition into different locked containers or locations. Option C. Suggest the owner purchase a high-security gun safe, as this is the most effective way to ensure the safety of any firearms, regardless of current regulations. Option D. Recommend that the owner keep the firearms unloaded and locked in the cabinet, and that the ammunition can remain in the same cabinet as long as it is clearly marked as ammunition. The correct answer is B. Advise the owner that while the firearms are unloaded and in a locked cabinet, storing ammunition in the same locked cabinet, even in a separate box, is not compliant with the Criminal Code of Canada's safe storage regulations for non-restricted firearms, and recommend immediate separation of firearms and ammunition into different locked containers or locations. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential gap in the safe storage of firearms within a rural household in Ontario, Canada. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the firearms safety instructor to balance the need for thoroughness in assessing compliance with the Criminal Code of Canada and Ontario's provincial firearms regulations against the potential for overreach or misinterpretation of the law, which could lead to unnecessary distress for the homeowner. Careful judgment is required to ensure all legal requirements are met without creating undue burden. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of the homeowner's existing storage methods against the specific requirements outlined in the Criminal Code of Canada, particularly sections related to safe storage of non-restricted firearms, and any relevant Ontario provincial legislation or guidelines that may supplement federal law. This includes verifying that firearms are unloaded, secured with a trigger lock or cable lock, and stored separately from ammunition, and that the storage location itself meets the criteria for preventing unauthorized access. The instructor must also confirm that the homeowner possesses the appropriate firearms license and registration certificates for all firearms. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal obligations for safe firearm storage as mandated by federal and provincial law, ensuring public safety and compliance. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the homeowner's verbal assurance that their firearms are stored safely without any physical verification of the storage methods. This fails to meet the instructor's duty to ensure actual compliance with the Criminal Code of Canada and Ontario's regulations, which often require demonstrable evidence of safe storage practices. Another incorrect approach would be to recommend storage methods that are not explicitly mandated by law, such as suggesting the use of a specific brand of gun safe if the law only requires a locked container. This goes beyond the legal requirements and could be seen as imposing unnecessary costs or conditions on the homeowner. Furthermore, an incorrect approach would be to dismiss any potential storage concerns based on the homeowner's long-standing ownership of firearms, assuming that experience equates to continued compliance. The law requires adherence to current safe storage regulations regardless of the owner's history. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the letter and spirit of the law. This involves 1. Understanding the specific legal requirements for safe storage in Ontario, Canada, as per the Criminal Code of Canada and any applicable provincial statutes. 2. Conducting a thorough, objective assessment of the current storage practices against these legal requirements. 3. Providing clear, evidence-based feedback and recommendations for any necessary improvements, focusing on compliance and safety. 4. Documenting the assessment and any recommendations made. Question 18. The efficiency study reveals that a resident in rural Ontario has stored their hunting rifle unloaded in a locked gun cabinet within a detached, locked shed on their property. Ammunition is kept in a separate, unlocked metal box also within the shed. The resident states they have owned firearms for 30 years without incident and believes this method is sufficient for safe storage. Based on the Canadian Firearms Safety Course, CFSC, principles and Ontario regulations, which of the following actions best addresses the safe storage requirements? Option A. Recommend that the resident consider a more robust locking mechanism for the shed, as this is the primary security measure. Option B. Accept the resident's assurance of 30 years of safe ownership as evidence of adequate storage practices, as the rifle is unloaded and in a locked cabinet. Option C. Inform the resident that rural storage practices are generally less scrutinized and that their current method, given the circumstances, is likely acceptable. Option D. Advise the resident that while the rifle is unloaded and in a locked cabinet, the ammunition must also be secured in a locked container separate from the firearm, and the current storage of ammunition is non-compliant. The correct answer is D. Advise the resident that while the rifle is unloaded and in a locked cabinet, the ammunition must also be secured in a locked container separate from the firearm, and the current storage of ammunition is non-compliant. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a potential gap in the safe storage of firearms within a rural household in Ontario, Canada. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal obligations of firearm ownership with the practical realities of rural living, where distances to secure storage facilities might be greater, and the perceived immediate threat might differ from urban environments. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Firearms Act, Ontario, and its associated regulations without imposing undue hardship or misinterpreting the spirit of the law. The best approach involves a thorough assessment of the existing storage methods against the specific requirements of the Ontario Firearms Act and the Criminal Code of Canada concerning the safe storage of firearms. This includes verifying that all firearms are unloaded, that ammunition is stored separately from the firearms, and that both firearms and ammunition are secured in a manner that prevents unauthorized access, such as in locked containers or rooms, and that the locking devices are appropriate for the type of firearm. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the legal mandates for safe storage, which are paramount for public safety and responsible firearm ownership in Ontario. Adherence to these regulations minimizes the risk of accidental discharge, theft, and diversion of firearms for criminal use, thereby upholding the principles of public safety enshrined in Canadian law. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the owner's assertion that the firearms are generally safe because they are kept in a locked shed, without verifying the specific security measures in place. This is professionally unacceptable as it bypasses the detailed requirements of the law, such as ensuring firearms are unloaded and ammunition is stored separately and securely. Law does not permit a subjective interpretation of generally safe. It mandates specific, verifiable security protocols. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the property is rural and the owner is a long-time resident with no prior incidents, the storage is automatically compliant. This is a failure to apply due diligence and a misinterpretation of the law, which applies universally regardless of location or past record. The legal requirements for safe storage are not conditional on the owner's history or the remoteness of their location. A further incorrect approach would be to focus only on the security of the firearms themselves, neglecting the separate and equally important requirement for the secure storage of ammunition. The law explicitly mandates that ammunition must be stored separately from firearms and secured in a way that prevents unauthorized access. Overlooking this aspect constitutes a significant regulatory failure. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the relevant legislation, Firearms Act, Criminal Code of Canada, and any provincial regulations specific to Ontario. This involves a systematic checklist approach to verify each component of safe storage, coupled with an objective assessment of the physical security measures. When in doubt, seeking clarification from the relevant authorities or consulting official guidance documents is crucial. The ultimate goal is to ensure that all legal requirements are met, thereby promoting public safety and responsible firearm ownership. Question 19. Market research demonstrates that many individuals in Ontario engage in hunting activities that involve minors. Considering the legal framework for firearm possession and transportation in Ontario, Canada, what is the most appropriate and legally compliant method for an adult licensed firearm owner to transport an unloaded firearm to a hunting location when accompanied by a minor who will be supervised? Option A. The unloaded firearm can be left in its locked case inside the vehicle, while the supervising adult briefly leaves the vehicle to obtain necessary permits. Option B. The firearm can be transported unloaded in the same bag as the ammunition, provided the bag is closed and the adult is present. Option C. The minor can carry the unloaded firearm in a locked case while the supervising adult walks a short distance ahead, ensuring the firearm is not immediately accessible to others. Option D. The firearm must be transported unloaded in a locked case, with ammunition stored separately and inaccessible. The supervising adult must maintain direct control and supervision of the minor and the firearm throughout the transportation process. The correct answer is D. The firearm must be transported unloaded in a locked case, with ammunition stored separately and inaccessible. The supervising adult must maintain direct control and supervision of the minor and the firearm throughout the transportation process. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the legal requirements for firearm possession and transportation in Ontario with the practicalities of a specific situation involving a minor. The core tension lies in ensuring compliance with the Criminal Code of Canada and Ontario's provincial regulations regarding firearms, while also considering the safety and legal implications of a young person's involvement. Careful judgment is required to avoid any actions that could be construed as unsafe, illegal, or contributing to a minor's unauthorized access to a firearm. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves ensuring the firearm is transported unloaded in a locked case and separate from ammunition, and that the individual accompanying the minor is a licensed adult who is legally permitted to supervise the minor's handling of the firearm. This aligns directly with the requirements of the Criminal Code of Canada, specifically sections pertaining to the safe storage, transportation, and use of firearms, the regulations under the Ontario Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act and the Ontario Trespass to Property Act, which govern hunting and firearm possession by minors. The emphasis is on maintaining control and legal compliance at all times, ensuring the firearm is never accessible to the minor without direct, lawful supervision. Incorrect approach is analysis. Transporting the firearm unloaded but in the same bag as ammunition, even if the bag is not locked, is a regulatory failure. The Criminal Code of Canada mandates that firearms and ammunition be transported separately to prevent immediate use. Allowing the minor to carry the unloaded firearm in a locked case while the adult walks ahead, even if the adult is licensed, creates a period of unsupervised possession for the minor, which is a violation of safe handling practices and potentially provincial laws regarding supervision. Leaving the firearm unloaded, and in its case unattended in the vehicle, while the adult goes to retrieve hunting permits is a critical safety and legal failure. This constitutes an unsecured firearm, violating storage regulations and creating a significant risk of unauthorized access or theft. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation must prioritize adherence to all applicable laws and regulations governing firearms. A systematic approach should involve 1. Identifying all relevant federal and provincial legislation, Criminal Code of Canada, Ontario Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act, etc. 2. Assessing the specific circumstances against these legal requirements, particularly concerning minors and transportation. 3. Choosing the course of action that demonstrably meets all legal obligations for safe storage, transportation, and supervision. 4. Documenting the process and decisions made if necessary. The guiding principle is always safety and legality, with no exceptions for convenience or perceived minor deviations. Question 20. The efficiency study reveals that a licensed firearms dealer in Ontario needs to transport a shipment of 50 non-restricted firearms from their main warehouse to a retail outlet. The dealer has standard lockable gun cases that are 120 cm long, 30 cm wide, and 10 cm high. The delivery van has a cargo area measuring 5 meters long, 5 meters wide, and 2 meters high. The van's maximum payload capacity is 500 kg, and each unloaded non-restricted firearm weighs an average of 4 kg. What is the maximum number of non-restricted firearms that can be legally and safely transported in a single trip, assuming each firearm must be unloaded, its bolt removed, and placed in a locked gun case with ammunition stored separately? Option A, 30. Option B, 40. Option C, 25. Option D, 50. The correct answer is A, 30. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a need to optimize the storage and transportation of firearms for a licensed dealer in Ontario, Canada. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing operational efficiency with strict adherence to the Canadian Firearms Program regulations, specifically the Firearms Act and its associated regulations, which govern the safe storage, transportation, and transfer of firearms. Misinterpreting or neglecting these regulations can lead to severe penalties, including license suspension or revocation, and potential criminal charges. The best professional approach involves calculating the maximum number of non-restricted firearms that can be transported in a single vehicle load, considering the dimensions of the storage containers and the vehicle's cargo capacity, while ensuring compliance with the safe transportation requirements. This approach prioritizes safety and legal compliance by directly addressing the physical limitations and regulatory mandates for transporting firearms. Specifically, it requires understanding that non-restricted firearms must be unloaded, the bolt or operating mechanism removed or disabled, and stored in a locked container separate from ammunition. The calculation would involve determining how many such containers can be safely and legally secured within the vehicle, without exceeding weight limits or compromising the vehicle's stability, and ensuring each container is locked and the firearms within are rendered inoperable. This aligns with the fundamental principles of safe firearm handling and storage mandated by Canadian law. An incorrect approach would be to simply maximize the number of firearms based on perceived space, without verifying regulatory compliance for each firearm's storage and transport. This fails to account for the specific legal requirements for rendering firearms inoperable and securing them in locked containers, potentially leading to violations if firearms are not properly secured, or if the containers themselves do not meet the definition of a locked container, as per the regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed of loading and unloading over the secure and compliant packaging of each firearm. This overlooks the critical requirement that firearms must be unloaded and their action disabled before being placed in a locked container, and that ammunition must be stored separately. A further incorrect approach would be to assume that all firearms can be transported in the same manner, regardless of their classification: restricted, non-restricted, prohibited. This is a critical regulatory failure, as each classification has distinct transportation and storage requirements under the Firearms Act. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all applicable regulations for the specific task. This involves consulting the Firearms Act and its regulations, as well as any relevant provincial or municipal bylaws. Next, they should gather all necessary data, such as vehicle dimensions, container specifications, and firearm classifications. Then, they must perform calculations to ensure compliance with all legal requirements, prioritizing safety and legality above all else. Finally, they should document their process and findings to demonstrate due diligence.